On January 5, 1942, as triumphant cries of victory echoed through the streets of Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto summoned the staff of the Imperial Combined Fleet. The first phase of Japan's Pacific campaign had unfolded with astonishing speed, and now he ordered preparations for the second stage of operations. Reports from the Philippines, Malaya, and the Southern Front suggested that within a matter of months, Japanese forces would dominate East Asia and the territories struck in December. With this in mind, Yamamoto instructed his chief of staff, Motome Ugaki, to have the next set of plans ready by mid-February. The breathtaking pace of Japan's conquests stunned even the most seasoned planners in Tokyo. Yet, it also ignited fierce debate within the Imperial General Staff. On one side stood the hardline nationalists, intoxicated by victory and eager to push forward without restraint, regardless of how far such ambitions might stretch Japan's resources. On the other side was Yamamoto himself, a man who had never been enthusiastic about plunging into war with the United States and Britain. He worried not about the present triumphs, but about the inevitable future reckoning. Yamamoto's caution was so well known that his allies feared for his life. To protect him from potential assassination by extremists enraged at his opposition to an unlimited war, he remained at sea aboard the flagship Yamato rather than in Tokyo. His views were no secret. Ugaki, in his diary, recorded Yamamoto's frequent warnings that Japan required far-sighted statesmanship if it hoped to survive beyond the first flush of victory. Yamamoto often reminded his colleagues that Japan could not hope to outlast the Western powers in a prolonged struggle. His criticism was directed at political leaders such as Prince Konoe, whom he accused of lacking any coherent vision for the kind of war Japan should wage. Months before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had confided his fears to his friend Ryoichi Sasakawa, president of the ultranationalist Kokusuikai organization. Meeting at the Imperial Navy Club in Shiba, Yamamoto had warned that war was now unavoidable thanks to reckless political decisions. At first he predicted Japan would sweep forward effortlessly, like an octopus spreading its tentacles. Yet he cautioned, such euphoria would be fleeting. The true moment for political maneuvering, Yamamoto argued, would come with the fall of Singapore. That disaster, he believed, would shake British confidence in India and open the door to peace negotiations. Yamamoto knew the British well, having served on the Japanese delegations to the London naval conferences of 1930 and 1934. He also understood the Americans, having been naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. He accepted that once war began, Japan needed a decisive early victory, but he also believed the nation had only 18 months to enjoy its glory. "We must secure peace within that time," he told Sasakawa, urging him to spread this message among the right-wing political elite. By early January, victory seemed tantalizingly close. The American battleship fleet had been crippled at Pearl Harbor on December 7th. The British battleships Repulse and Prince of Wales had been sunk off Malaya. Manila and the U.S. naval base at Cavite had fallen, Hong Kong had surrendered, and Japanese forces were advancing toward new landings in the Dutch East Indies, New Ireland, Ambon, and the Solomons. Yet Pearl Harbor had not delivered everything Yamamoto had hoped. The American aircraft carriers, absent from port that day, remained intact, a constant looming threat. What Japan needed now was another spectacular blow. Singapore's fall, which Yamamoto expected in 5 or 6 months, it came on February 15th, would not be enough. He sought a victory so dramatic it would force the Americans to the negotiating table. The question was, where to strike next? Yamamoto's proposal to attack the Soviet Union was vetoed by the army, already bogged down in China and Southeast Asia. 3 other options emerged. Yamamoto's favorite was a bold thrust into the Indian Ocean, invade Ceylon, lure out the British Eastern Fleet, annihilate it as he had done at Pearl Harbor, and then push into the Middle East to link with German forces advancing toward the Caucasus oil fields. Such a move would secure Japan's fuel supplies indefinitely. The army, however, dismissed the idea. That left 2 alternatives. The Naval General Staff in Tokyo advocated an invasion of Australia, depriving the Americans of a forward base. After seizing the Solomons, the plan envisioned taking New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. Some at Imperial headquarters were already drafting occupation systems for Australia and New Zealand. But Yamamoto opposed the scheme. It would take too long and lacked the dramatic impact he sought. He also recognized that Pearl Harbor had awakened a fierce American thirst for vengeance. The Japanese had long dismissed Americans as soft and decadent, but Yamamoto knew better. Even the capture of Singapore would not quench their resolve. What Japan needed was a victory so overwhelming that it could extend an olive branch from a position of strength. Thus, in January, Yamamoto ordered a new plan. By March, his officers carried to Tokyo the MI plan, envisioning a decisive battle near Midway Island, where the U.S. carrier fleet would be destroyed. Alongside it was the AL plan, detailing an invasion of Alaska's Aleutian Islands. If successful, Japan might even occupy Hawaii and eventually the American West Coast. At the very least, victories at Midway and in the Aleutians would give Japan leverage for peace. The admirals in Tokyo argued bitterly, but Yamamoto prevailed. The potential significance of Singapore's fall in February and the looming collapse of Bataan and Corregidor was overshadowed by a shocking event. The Doolittle raid of April 1942, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's B-25 bombers struck Tokyo itself, stunning the Japanese and proving that America was only beginning to fight. When the Midway operation ended in catastrophe that June, there was no time for recriminations. The Army was not even told the full truth. The loss of 4 fleet carriers was concealed, known only to the highest levels of the Navy. While Yamamoto gambled at Midway, the Naval General Staff had steadily shifted forces southward, preparing to sever Australia's lifeline. By late January, Japanese forces had seized Rabaul, launching constant air raids across the region. Australians, alarmed, warned General Douglas MacArthur upon his arrival in March that New Guinea would soon be attacked. If successful, Japan could threaten northern Australia itself. Darwin had already been bombed in February, and in March, the Japanese landed at Salamaua. In May, just before Midway, they attempted to seize Port Moresby, only to be repelled in the fierce Battle of the Coral Sea. Though the Japanese occupied Tulagi and built a seaplane base there, the battle convinced planners in Washington and Canberra that Japan's southern thrust was imminent. MacArthur urged the Australian government to brace for invasion and cabled General George C. Marshall for reinforcements, 2 carriers and 1,000 planes. But Admiral Ernest J. King, U.S. Chief of Naval Operations, replied that only 2 carriers were available in the Pacific until late June. Meanwhile, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz had already warned of a major Japanese move, which indeed materialized at Midway. Even as Midway unfolded, Japanese forces pressed ahead in the Solomons and New Guinea. Major General Tomitaro Hori landed the South Seas Force at Salamaua, while naval troops occupied Lae and began constructing an air base. Independent of Yamamoto, the Imperial General Staff had ordered Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake to continue the advance toward New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, and to prepare for a renewed assault on Port Moresby by July. Despite the disaster at Midway, reported to field commanders as a victory, Imperial headquarters refused to alter its plans. Within days, Australian intelligence warned MacArthur that Japan was preparing to move again. Buoyed by what they believed was their triumph at Midway, General Douglas MacArthur urged the Allies to seize the initiative. His proposal was bold: launch a preemptive strike against New Britain and New Ireland, followed by a direct assault on Rabaul, the linchpin of Japanese naval and air power in the region. With 2 carriers, 1,000 planes, and an amphibious division, MacArthur believed he could drive the Japanese back toward Truk, their central stronghold. On June 12th, General George C. Marshall presented MacArthur's plan to Admiral Ernest J. King, though with modifications. Marshall wanted 3 carriers instead of 2, plus 1 Marine division and 3 Army divisions to carry out the assaults. King, however, opposed the scheme. His primary objection was that it would place MacArthur in overall command of the fighting, something King was unwilling to accept. He also argued that carriers would be dangerously exposed to land-based air attack and lacked sufficient protection. Ironically, these very problems would later plague the Navy at Guadalcanal. Instead, King devised his own plan, a Navy-led drive from the New Hebrides. MacArthur bristled at the idea of his Army forces serving under naval command, but the urgency of halting Japan's advance toward New Guinea, and ultimately Australia, left little room for debate. The Joint Chiefs of Staff faced a thorny question: who would command the operation? They resolved it by dividing responsibilities. Phase 1. The capture of the Santa Cruz Islands. Tulagi and nearby positions went to Admiral King. At this stage, Guadalcanal was considered little more than a dot on the map, without obvious strategic value. In Phase 2, MacArthur would assume command. Tasked with mopping up Japanese forces in the Solomons, Rabaul and New Guinea, King prevailed largely because the Joint Chiefs recognized that he already had a defensive line planned across the Pacific to shield Australia, and his approach required fewer troops than MacArthur's ambitious proposal. Thousands of soldiers were training in New Caledonia, and King had persuaded General Henry "Hap" Arnold to send several squadrons of U.S. Army Air Force planes there. He had also reinforced Samoa and Efate in the New Hebrides, with plans for a base in Tonga. Meanwhile, Admiral Wilson Brown, whose indecision during the Wake Island crisis had irritated King, was reassigned to head the new Amphibious Training Command in San Diego. There, alongside Marine Major General Holland Smith, he was tasked with developing new techniques for island warfare. King's chief planner, Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, outlined a 4-stage strategy. Hold the line in the South Pacific while training amphibious forces. Launch a combined U.S., Australian and New Zealand offensive through the Solomons to the Bismarck Archipelago and the Admiralty Islands, seize the Caroline and Marshall Islands. Advance either into the Dutch East Indies or the Philippines. King approved the plan immediately. It mirrored his own vision. He arranged for Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, then serving as a naval observer in London, to command the new South Pacific Force. Turner was detached from the Plans Division and ordered to prepare for amphibious operations. All of this was set in motion even before the Japanese struck at Port Moresby and Tulagi. Gormley departed Washington on May 1st, scheduled to assume command on June 19th. First, however, he had to report to Admiral Chester W. Nimitz at Pearl Harbor, his direct superior. By the time Gormley arrived, the Japanese offensive in the South Pacific was already underway. On May 22nd, an Army plane spotted a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft photographing Guadalcanal. By June 25th, intelligence reported that grass on the island's central plain had been burned off, tents erected, and a wharf under construction at Lunga Point. 6 days later, an Australian coastwatcher confirmed that an airfield was about to be built, awaiting only the arrival of Japanese construction units, the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, equivalent to American Seabees. This intelligence was corroborated by radio intercepts at Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet's codebreakers, who had already cracked portions of the Japanese naval code, intercepted a message confirming that the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces would arrive on July 4th. Admiral Turner, visiting Pearl Harbor en route to prepare for amphibious landings, immediately recognized the target. It could only be the Solomons. Within 2 weeks, Turner was in Wellington, New Zealand, boarding his flagship, the USS Macaulay, formerly the passenger liner Santa Barbara. His daunting task: train an entire amphibious task force in just 1 month. Meanwhile, Gormley traveled to Melbourne to confer with MacArthur. Pessimism clouded his outlook. He doubted the wisdom of staging an amphibious assault when no one had real experience in such operations. MacArthur, for his own reasons, agreed. Both men concluded that with the limited aircraft available, they could not guarantee adequate air cover for the landings. On July 18th, barely 3 weeks before the scheduled assault, they sent a dispatch to Washington recommending postponement. King's response was blunt: no delays. He had warned Gormley from the outset that the job would be difficult and that proper resources might not arrive until autumn. Nevertheless, the invasion would proceed. Gormley's gloom deepened when his requests for Seabees and other support units were denied. From the start, the Guadalcanal operation was plagued by intelligence failures. Everyone knew an operation was imminent, especially after July 10th when Nimitz issued Gormley his orders. Yet Allied intelligence reports downplayed the Japanese airfield construction, even misplacing its location on the island. By the end of July, however, the Japanese had completed the airfield, and at Combined Fleet Headquarters in Japan, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto ordered the first mission to depart Rabaul on August 14th. As overall commander, Gormley struggled to secure more planes and bases, but King's earlier warning proved true. The tools simply weren't available. Even logistics faltered. Supplies for the invasion force were loaded haphazardly onto transports at Oakland. Though docks were available to reorganize the cargo properly, the ships were instead sent to Noumea, which lacked such facilities. King understood the difficulties but insisted there was no time to waste. The Japanese advance toward Australia had to be stopped. By late July, the rush was on. 177,000 Marines were moving by troop ship from California, Pearl Harbor, Noumea, and Samoa. Gormley was too overwhelmed to convene his commanders, so on July 28th, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, in tactical command, called a meeting aboard his flagship, the carrier Saratoga. For the first time, the tactical unit commanders gathered to discuss the invasion. Fletcher's role was to protect the landings with his carrier task force, while Turner would deliver the Marines under General Alexander Vandegrift. Once the island was secured, garrison troops would follow, but the operation had been thrown together so hastily that no reserve forces were available. The South Pacific simply had no more men to spare. The meeting aboard Saratoga was tense. Fletcher announced he would cover the landings at Guadalcanal for only 2 days, insisting the carriers could not be risked longer. Gormley's staff reluctantly agreed. Fletcher, cautious to the point of timidity, believed the entire operation was reckless and doomed. Turner, however, saw the broader strategic picture. He rebuked Fletcher, reminding him that the decision had been made at the highest levels. Their duty was not to argue, but to carry out orders, no matter the risk, Admiral. Frank Jack Fletcher should have learned his lesson after the Battle of the Coral Sea. Admiral Ernest J. King had been so displeased with Fletcher's habitual caution and reluctance to engage that he ordered Admiral Chester W. Nimitz to evaluate Fletcher's fighting spirit. Nimitz, a kindly man who liked Fletcher personally, gave him a pep talk. And when Midway ended in a stunning American victory under Fletcher's command, criticism was muted. Yet, on the eve of the first major American offensive of the war, Fletcher's announcement that he would withdraw his carriers after only 48 hours of support cast a long shadow. To the Marines and sailors preparing for battle, it sounded like abandonment before the fight had even begun. The rehearsal for the Guadalcanal invasion took place on July 28th at Coro Island near Fiji and lasted 3 days. It was a fiasco. Only a third of the assigned troops managed to get ashore, and once they did, confusion reigned. General Alexander Vandegrift judged the exercise a complete failure. But there was no time to dwell on mistakes. By July 31st, the Marines were back aboard their transports, heading toward destiny. On the afternoon of August 6th, as the task force of 75 ships neared the Solomons, Fletcher detached his carriers, keeping them at a cautious distance. He would provide air cover as promised, but his 26 ships were moved as far from danger as possible. If American intelligence had failed by allowing the Japanese to build an airfield on Guadalcanal unnoticed, Japanese intelligence was worse. In July 1942, the Japanese army was preoccupied with its campaign in New Guinea, intended as a springboard for operations against Australia and New Zealand. Major General Tomataro Hori's South Seas Force landed 2,000 troops near Buna, planning to build airfields there as a prelude to another assault on Port Moresby. Japanese air power was thus concentrated on New Guinea, with bombers and fighters striking Port Moresby almost daily. Meanwhile, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's flagship Yamato lay anchored at Hashirajima in Japanese waters. Yamamoto, in no hurry, was preparing for future operations over Australia. On August 3rd, Japanese naval air groups stationed at Lae were recalled to Rabaul to prepare for what they believed would be the next phase of operations. During the first week of August, heavy cloud cover limited Japanese reconnaissance. Only a handful of search planes flew, and none spotted the massive American armada steaming toward Guadalcanal. Japanese pilots flying from Rabaul were startled to encounter American carrier aircraft near Buin. They had been told that U.S. carriers had been destroyed at Midway, so they assumed these planes must belong to Australian forces. In reality, the Americans were rehearsing for the coming invasion. After 8 months of uninterrupted victories, the Japanese High Command could not imagine the Allies attempting a seaborne invasion. Had the idea been suggested, they would likely have agreed with MacArthur and Gormley that such an operation had little chance of success. Thus, as the American Expeditionary Force advanced, it enjoyed the priceless advantage of total surprise. On August 4th and 5th, the fleet pressed forward under overcast skies. On August 6th, rain squalls shielded its approach. Then, at dawn on August 7th, the skies cleared. Perfect weather for carrier strikes. At 5:30 a.m., the fleet went to general quarters. Half an hour later, the carriers Wasp, Saratoga, and Enterprise launched their first waves. Their targets: Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. The Japanese had established a seaplane base at Gavutu and Tanambogo, linked by a narrow causeway. Bad weather the previous day had grounded their aircraft. Fletcher's task force reported only one unidentified plane during the approach, but whether it was Japanese or Allied remained unclear. The Japanese were not alerted until 6:12 a.m., when the communications center at Tulagi sent a desperate message: enemy heavy bombardment in progress. The warning went out to the 4th, 6th, and 8th fleets, to Yamamoto, and to Imperial headquarters. By then it was too late. American fighters and bombers swept in through scattered clouds, illuminated by the pale light of a quarter moon. 8 fighters from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant L.H. Bauer, strafed Guadalcanal's airfield at Lunga Point, targeting supply dumps and installations. They found no aircraft or patrol boats, only empty buildings. Another 8 fighters maintained combat air patrol over the transports. Meanwhile, bombers struck Tulagi and Lunga Point. The skies remained uncontested. The Japanese never rose to meet them. The only American losses came from operational mishaps. At Gavutu, the surprise was devastating. Carrier planes bombed and strafed the seaplanes moored in the harbor, destroying 9 floatplanes, a 4-engine Kawanishi flying boat, and 8 other aircraft used for reconnaissance and bombing. A few Japanese pilots attempted to take off but were shot down before leaving the water. Not a single plane survived. Other strikes hit Japanese troop concentrations on Tulagi and the beaches where Marines would soon land. As dawn broke, Marines aboard the transports glimpsed the high ridges of their objective. The ship slipped through the narrow channel between Guadalcanal and Savo Island into Sealark Channel. At first light, the escorting cruisers and destroyers opened fire. Explosions lit the shoreline, and an oil dump erupted in flames. After 2 hours of bombardment, landing craft churned toward the beaches east of Lunga Point. At 9 a.m., the first American troops waded ashore on Guadalcanal. To their astonishment, they met no resistance. The Japanese had fled into the hills. The landing was almost absurdly easy. Marines found abandoned barracks, tents torn by shrapnel, and even a breakfast table still set with rice, meat, and plums. Chopsticks dropped hastily as the enemy fled, but any sense of triumph was premature. The Japanese on Guadalcanal had been construction troops, not combat soldiers, and they had not yet fortified their positions. Across the channel on Tulagi, the story was very different. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Marine Raider Battalion, alongside the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines, encountered fierce resistance. About 250 Japanese troops of the Yokohama Air Group Detachment, commanded by Captain Masaki Miyazaki, defended the island. Unlike the construction units on Guadalcanal, these were seasoned, determined fighters. Edson's raiders were themselves elite. All volunteers, they had trained under grueling conditions and carried a reputation as the toughest American troops in the Pacific. The raider concept had been inspired by Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson, who had studied guerrilla tactics while serving with the Chinese Communist 8th Route Army in its struggle against Japan. Edson's men were hardened, disciplined, and inventive, qualities they would need in abundance. Tulagi became the first true testing ground. For the first time since December 1941, highly trained American troops clashed directly with experienced Japanese veterans. The Japanese carried with them the aura of invincibility, earned through their lightning conquests in the Philippines, Malaya, and the East Indies. Tokyo had boasted of these victories for months, and much of the world had come to believe the myth of Japanese supremacy. At 8:15 a.m., Edson's raiders landed on the northwestern shore of Tulagi. At first, resistance was light, limited to scattered outposts. The terrain itself posed the greatest challenge: dense jungle, tangled vines, and thorny bougainvillea. But soon the Marines would discover that the real obstacle was far more formidable, the enemy waiting deeper within the island. Colonel Merritt. Edson's raiders lost only a single man during the initial landing on Tulagi, a Marine felled by a sniper's bullet. Edson's plan was straightforward: push inland to the ridge that spanned the island's length, then sweep southward along its crest, clearing the slopes as they advanced. But the terrain was merciless. Dense jungle, tangled vines, and steep inclines slowed progress to a crawl. It took 3 exhausting hours for the Marines to hack their way just a mile and a half up the rising ground. When they finally reached the ridgeline and emerged from the jungle, they stumbled directly into the heart of the Japanese defenses. Dugouts, rock embrasures, and carefully sighted machine guns created interlocking fields of fire. The Japanese strategy was simple: keep the enemy pinned below them. Yet the Marines adapted quickly. By crawling up the cliffs, they were able to lob grenades and dynamite charges into the dugouts. It was brutal, close-quarters fighting. In one position, 17 Japanese were killed by explosives. But even after a dugout was blasted, danger lingered. In one case, a Marine entered a shattered position to retrieve a radio, only to be shot by 2 Japanese soldiers who had survived the blast. Another Marine who rushed to help was also killed before the defenders were finally silenced. Edson's men pressed on. One section attacked the central defenses while the rest of the force pushed down the ridge. Even so, progress was costly. One company suffered 15% casualties that first afternoon, and the Japanese resistance was not limited to frontal fire. Snipers seemed to be everywhere, tied into trees, hidden in buildings, crouched behind rocks. Their favored tactic was to let the lead elements of a Marine unit pass, then open fire on the men from behind. It was almost always a death sentence for the sniper, but not before he inflicted several casualties. The Marines also discovered that the small 6.5mm Japanese rifle and machine gun rounds were more likely to wound than kill, a deliberate tactic, since caring for the wounded drained manpower and resources. By late afternoon, the raiders reached a 3-sided ravine whose floor had once been a British cricket field. The Japanese had dug into the ravine walls, creating deadly crossfire zones. Edson halted the advance as darkness fell. This was no time to probe blindly into such a trap. That night, the Marines experienced their first taste of the ferocious Japanese counterattack. Knowing they were outnumbered and doomed, the defenders launched a desperate assault at 10:30 p.m. They broke through between 2 Marine companies surrounding one of them. Fighting raged in foxholes and open ground alike, with rifles, machine guns, grenades, and even knives. The Japanese surged toward Edson's command post, coming within 50 yards before being thrown back. The Marines prevailed, but one company lost half its non-commissioned officers in the melee. On August 8th, reinforcements swelled the American presence on Tulagi to 7,500 men. Edson's raiders and the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines resumed their push toward the island's southeastern end. One by one, they stormed the dug-in machine gun nests along the steep slopes of the cricket ground. In one cave, they found 35 Japanese dead, some long decomposed, others freshly killed. The Marines quickly realized that Japanese soldiers would hold a position to the last man unless explicitly ordered to retreat. The discipline and fanaticism of the Japanese stunned the Americans. In one dugout, 3 officers, armed with only a single pistol, chose suicide over capture. As the Marines prepared to storm the position, they heard 3 shots. Inside, they found the 3 bodies. One officer had shot his comrades, then himself. At first, this suicidal resolve baffled the Marines. Why would men, cornered and hopeless, choose certain death rather than surrender? But after several Japanese feigned surrender, only to attack with hidden weapons or grenades, the Marines adjusted. From then on, they no longer attempted to coax Japanese soldiers into giving up. Tulagi was declared secure by the 2nd day, though isolated snipers continued to harass the Americans for days afterward. The ferocity of the fighting was epitomized by gunnery. Sergeant Angus Goss, advancing ahead of his men to silence a cave near the cricket field, he lobbed grenades inside. Twice, the Japanese threw them back before they exploded. Furious, Goss called for a satchel charge, a bag of dynamite. He primed it and hurled it into the cave, but the defenders shoved it out again. The blast wounded Goss with a rock splinter, but he was undeterred. Grabbing his submachine gun, he stormed into the cave, spraying fire. 4 Japanese fell before him, and 8 more lay dead from earlier fighting. If Tulagi was brutal, the battles on Gavutu and Tanambogo were even worse. The landings there began mid-morning. Few troops were committed at first, as little resistance was expected. But the Japanese had fortified the seaplane base, and the Marines quickly ran into trouble. The first wave met only scattered rifle fire, but by the time the second wave hit the beach, the defenders had regrouped. By the third wave, fire was so intense that landing craft were raked before they touched shore, and casualties mounted. Both islands were dominated by small hills, less than 150 feet high, but high enough to command the beaches. The Japanese had dug in along the slopes with machine guns, automatic rifles, and ample ammunition. As on Tulagi, every position had to be taken by direct assault. The defenders never retreated. The fighting on Tanambogo was particularly savage. Early waves included tanks, but the Japanese swarmed them with crowbars, grenades, and gasoline-soaked rags. One tank commander opened his hatch and cut down 23 attackers with the machine gun before being stabbed to death by a bayonet-wielding soldier. Another tank was set ablaze when gasoline rags were shoved inside. By mid-afternoon, it was clear the Marines needed reinforcements. A unit from nearby Florida Island, where no Japanese were present, was called in. Tanambogo was eventually taken, but the Marines could not secure the causeway linking the two islands. Reinforcements were ordered across at dusk, preceded by a 5-minute naval bombardment. Tragically, one of the last shells struck a fuel dump, igniting the shoreline like daylight. As the Marines advanced, they were silhouetted against the sea, perfect targets for Japanese gunners. 2 boatloads reached the beach, but the coxswain of the third was killed and his craft veered back out to sea. Others followed, believing orders had changed. The stranded Marines clung to the concrete pier under relentless fire. Tracer rounds revealed their position, and casualties mounted. One boat withdrew with the wounded, while confusion delayed further landings. Meanwhile, the Japanese counterattacked. Captain Crane, leading the stranded unit, was cut off. With 5 men, he hid in the brush until darkness allowed them to slip back to the beach. Only at 4 a.m. on August 8th did fresh troops finally land and secure the causeway. When the battle began, there were roughly 500 Japanese defenders on the twin islets of Gavutu and Tanambogo. By the time the fighting ended, not a single one remained alive. Early on the morning of August 7th, the radio station at Tulagi sent out the first desperate warning of the American assault to Rabaul. The news stunned the Japanese airmen there, who had been preparing for another day of raids against Australian positions in New Guinea. Their orders were abruptly cancelled and every available aircraft was redirected to strike the American invasion fleet. Before they could even take off, however, grim reports arrived. The entire flying boat flotilla at Tulagi had been destroyed, and then all contact with the base was lost. The meaning was clear. Tulagi had fallen. At 8:30 a.m., a formation of 27 twin-engine Mitsubishi Betty bombers lifted off from Rabaul. They had been armed for a strike against New Guinea, so they carried bombs instead of torpedoes. Escorting them were 18 Zero fighters climbing to 13,000 feet before turning south along the coast of Bougainville. Just after 1 p.m., they were spotted by 4 Enterprise fighters flying at 18,000 feet. The Wildcats pounced. Lieutenant VP Deus shot down 1 bomber outright, with 4 more listed as probable kills. But the Zeros quickly intervened, and the Americans, following their instructions, broke off and sought cover in the clouds. 1 Wildcat was lost, and Deus's own plane was so badly damaged he barely managed to crash land on the Wasp. Elsewhere, Lieutenant G.E. Firebaugh led 6 Enterprise fighters into combat near Santa Isabel Island. 10 Zeros swooped in, overwhelming 3 Wildcats and shooting them down. The remaining 3 pressed their attack on the bombers, with Ensign R.N. Dibb downing 1 Betty. Radio electrician T.W.W. Rhodes scored the first confirmed Zero kill of the day, but the Japanese swarmed them in disciplined formations, never losing sight of their wingmen. Firebaugh, enlisted pilot W.S. Stevenson, Jr., and machinist W.H. Warden were all shot down. Firebaugh and Warden were later rescued by coast watchers, but Stevenson was never found. On other carriers, the story was similar. The bombers were easier prey than the nimble Zeros. 6 Wildcats of Flight 323 intercepted enemy bombers near Lunga Point, shooting down 4. Machinist Darunan destroyed 2 single-handedly. By 2:30 p.m., the Japanese bombers and fighters began their run over the invasion fleet. Coast watchers had already given ample warning. Paul Edward Mason, a peacetime copra planter stationed on Malab Hill overlooking Buin, had radioed at 9:08 a.m. that 24 bombers were en route to Guadalcanal, still 400 miles away. His message, relayed through Pearl Harbor, reached the fleet in plenty of time. The reaction aboard the Australian cruiser HMAS Canberra was typical. When the warning was piped, The boatswain's mate announced, "The ship will be attacked at noon by 24 torpedo bombers. All hands will pipe to dinner at 11, so." And right on schedule, the Japanese arrived. The American fighters climbed to 20,000 feet, waiting. As the bombers reached the north shore of Guadalcanal at noon, the Wildcats and the fleet's anti-aircraft guns opened up. For the first time in the South Pacific, the Japanese felt the sting of a coordinated counterattack. Of the 24 Bettys, 23 were shot down. Only the destroyer Mugford was damaged, struck by a bomb. Against the Zeros, however, the fight was different. Among the escort was Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading ace, chosen with 17 other elite pilots for this long-range mission. The American Wildcats ignored the Zeros and dove straight for the bombers, forcing the escorts to peel away and engage. Sakai was puzzled by the American tactics. Instead of turning dogfights, the Wildcats made slashing dives, then scattered into evasive maneuvers. They had been well briefed. The Zero was superior in speed, climb, and maneuverability, but fragile and lightly armed. In the ensuing melee, Sakai shot down one Wildcat and an SBD dive bomber that had recklessly attacked 4 Zeros alone. Several other Japanese pilots scored kills, though 1 Zero was lost. Sakai himself mistook a group of SBDs for fighters and charged them, only to be raked by the rear gunner's machine guns. His Zero was riddled with bullets, and he was badly wounded. Yet, through sheer will, he managed to fly the crippled plane 560 miles back to Rabaul before collapsing. The Zero still held a temporary edge in quality, but the Americans were learning fast. The F-4F Wildcat was slower and less agile, but it was rugged, with armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. Pilots were instructed to fight in pairs, using a thatch weave, a scissors maneuver that allowed 2 Wildcats to cover each other and concentrate firepower. It was a tactic that would soon even the odds. By nightfall of the first day, the invasion seemed secure. American troops had advanced near the airfield without serious resistance. A captured prisoner revealed that only about 600 combat troops and 400 laborers were on the island, most of whom had fled inland. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner had landed 11,000 Marines, and supplies piled high on the beaches. General Vandegrift worried that the beach force could not organize the flood of material. But with the carriers likely to withdraw soon, he was relieved to see the supplies still coming ashore. On the morning of August 8th, Coast Watcher Jack Red at Buka Passage spotted 45 Japanese dive bombers taking off from Cavite. His warning, relayed through Pearl Harbor, again gave the fleet time to prepare. Carrier planes intercepted many of the attackers, but this time the Americans did not escape unscathed. A blazing bomber crashed into the transport George F. Elliott, setting it ablaze. Another torpedo bomber struck the destroyer Jarvis, crippling her. Later that morning, Enterprise planes strafed Japanese troop concentrations along the Tanaru River and bombed the airfield again. At 10:02, 3 Wildcats intercepted Japanese torpedo bombers skimming low over the water. Machinist Darunin shot down one, Ensign V.H.H. Rouse destroyed 2 more, and Ensign J.D. Shoemaker downed another. By evening, Enterprise's Fighting 6 counted its losses, 6 pilots shot down by Zeros. The Japanese still held the edge in experience and aircraft, but the Americans were adapting quickly. The Enterprise Air Group commander concluded that the Zero's weaknesses, limited firepower and fragile construction, could be exploited. With discipline, teamwork, and the Wildcats' toughness, the Americans could hold their own. On the ground, the Marines pressed their attacks. On Tulagi, they suffered 90 casualties but secured the island by the end of the second day. Of the 250-man Japanese garrison, 200 were killed, 3 surrendered, and the rest swam across the strait to Florida Island to continue fighting. On Gavutu and Tanambogo, the Marines paid a heavier price, 250 casualties. But of the 500 Japanese defenders, not one survived. The Japanese garrison on Tulagi had been annihilated to the last man. The ferocity of that fight stood in stark contrast to the almost effortless progress of the Marines on Guadalcanal. On the morning of August 8th, they reached the edge of the half-finished airstrip that would soon be christened Henderson Field, in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. Spirits were high, and some Marines began to underestimate their enemy. "I wish those Japanese would come out and fight," one Marine muttered within earshot of war correspondent Richard Tregaskis of the International News Service. "All they do is run into the jungle." On the surface, it seemed like a soldier's dream war, the enemy melting away, the airfield within reach, and supplies pouring ashore. But the officers were uneasy. It was all too easy. At sea, the Americans also appeared unchallenged. A handful of Japanese patrol craft, tenders, and transports had been destroyed in the opening hours by shelling and bombing. Only in the skies did the enemy still pose a threat. Most of the first waves of Japanese bombers had been shot down, but the cost was steep. 21 of Admiral Fletcher's 99 carrier planes were lost. Though not catastrophic by operational standards, the attrition convinced Fletcher that his decision to withdraw his carriers was justified. At 6 p.m., he requested permission from Admiral Robert Gormley to pull back. Without waiting for a reply, Fletcher began to withdraw. When Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner intercepted Fletcher's dispatch, he was alarmed. The carrier's departure would leave the invasion force without air cover, just as Japanese reinforcements could be expected to arrive in strength. Turner knew the enemy would funnel more planes down the island chain, and without carriers overhead, the Marines on Guadalcanal would be dangerously exposed. Meanwhile, the Japanese were already moving. When the invasion message from Guadalcanal reached Rabaul, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commander of the 8th Fleet and the Outer South Seas Force, reacted swiftly. His first instinct was to reinforce the 2,000-man garrison on Guadalcanal. 6 small transports were loaded with troops and dispatched under destroyer escort. But fate intervened. The convoy ran into the American submarine S-38, operating out of Australia. The sub torpedoed and sank the transport Mayo Maru, killing 342 men. Shaken by the loss and reports of the massive American invasion fleet, Mikawa recalled the remaining transports. By then, however, Japanese naval power was already on the move. On the morning of August 7th, as Tulagi's garrison sent its final message, 5 heavy cruisers had departed Caviang on New Ireland. 3 were bound northeast for Manus in the Admiralties, 2 for Rabaul. Mikawa quickly ordered all 5 to converge on Rabaul. By noon, the cruiser Chokai, accompanied by a destroyer, entered Simpson Harbor. The other 4 cruisers waited in St. George's Channel between New Ireland and New Britain. Later that afternoon, Chokai rejoined them, carrying Mikawa himself, along with the light cruisers Tenryu and Yubari. Thus, Mikawa's strike force now consisted of 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer. As they sped south toward Guadalcanal, Mikawa devised his battle plan. By reducing speed, he could time his arrival for just after midnight on August 8th, launching a surprise night attack on the American invasion fleet. It was a bold gamble. Mikawa knew the Americans had several carriers in the area, while he had none. But a night battle would neutralize American air power. The Japanese Navy excelled at night fighting, with years of training in torpedo tactics and gunnery under cover of darkness. The Americans, by contrast, had little experience in night naval combat. If Mikawa could achieve surprise, the results could be devastating. What Mikawa did not know was that American weaknesses in intelligence and coordination would play directly into his hands. The divided command structure, the inadequacy of air reconnaissance, and the failure to cover obvious approaches left the invasion fleet vulnerable. During the day, U.S. B-17 bombers had sighted Japanese cruisers moving toward Rabaul. That evening, the submarine S-38 again reported contact as Mikawa's force emerged from St. George's Channel. But both reports were dismissed. Rabaul was a major Japanese base, and American commanders assumed such ship movements were routine. No one realized the cruisers were steaming south to strike Guadalcanal. Admiral Gormley, responsible for coordinating the entire operation, had to rely on a patchwork of reconnaissance sources. General Douglas MacArthur's U.S. Army Air Forces and the Royal Australian Air Force were tasked with long-range searches over the Bismarcks, focusing on Rabaul. Admiral John McCain's land-based naval air units, including PBY Catalina patrol planes, were to cover the northern approaches from Truk and the Marshalls. Fletcher's carrier planes were supposed to conduct short-range searches, but none were flown. Fletcher, preoccupied with his carrier's safety, neglected this duty. Admiral Turner, studying his charts, saw the danger clearly. The Japanese had a natural approach route down the west coast of Bougainville, through the narrow waters between Choiseul and Vella La Vella, past Colombangara between New Georgia and Santa Isabel, and finally between Florida Island and Guadalcanal's north coast. This corridor would soon earn a grim nickname, The slot. On the morning of August 8th, search plans were in place. 4 PBYs were to fly from Nandi and Fiji, sweeping a triangular route. 6 more from Espiritu Santo would patrol northeast over the Santa Cruz Islands. Another 6 from Ifate would spread across the slot north and west of Guadalcanal. 3 B-17s were to search north of the island. But when Turner reviewed the plan on the night of August 7th, he noticed a glaring omission. The slot itself was left uncovered. He requested a special search of the area, somewhere between Turner's flagship, McCain's headquarters, and the seaplane tender Mackinac at Ifate. The message was lost. The search was never flown. Thus, on August 8th, the Americans left unguarded the most obvious approach route for any Japanese naval force. And down that very corridor, Mikawa's cruisers were already racing toward Guadalcanal.